Lab 9 is an introduction to a new and very powerful software tool called LabVIEW. It's made by National Instruments and is used heavily in both research and industry as a measurement or control system. LabVIEW is considered a graphical programming platform, meaning instead of lines of code, LabVIEW codes are diagrams. And the concept is similar to how Simulink works. Let's launch LabVIEW so we can take a look at it. Alright. So the first thing to note is to launch the newest edition of LabVIEW installed on the computer. For me, that's LabVIEW 2014. So in this first menu that pops up, we want to select Create Project. Alright. And so in this next menu that pops up, we're going to have a few different options here. Alright, and we're going to want to select blank VI. VI stands for Virtual Instrument, which is at the heart of what we're going to be doing in this week's lab. We will be using our PCs as instrumentation. Alright, so let's click Finish. Alright, now you can see that we got two different windows that popped up. One is the front panel, which I'll click and drag to the side, and the other is the block diagram, which I'll move to the other side. Alright, it's very common for people to get confused between these two windows. To keep them straight, it helps to keep in mind what we're trying to accomplish by using LabVIEW. We are creating a virtual instrument. So think of the name front panel and apply it literally. This window is supposed to represent the front of an instrument. So, just like an actual instrument, this is where we'll be placing our inputs and reading our outputs. Now over here, the block diagram, this is supposed to represent the internals of an instrument, where all the data processing occurs. The next thing we need to do is to pull up a toolbox to let us place items in our virtual instrument, which we can do by right-clicking. In LabVIEW, these toolboxes are called a palette. There are two different palettes in LabVIEW. The Controls palette, which we have open right now, and it's only available for the front panel, and the Functions palette, which is only available for the block diagram. The two palettes do have some tools in common with one another, but they also have some tools that are unique to only itself. So, if you are ever looking for a tool and can't find it, make sure that you are looking in the correct palette. I cannot stress this point enough. If you're following along with your lab activities and suddenly can't find the tool you're looking for, double check what palette you are looking in. Alright, so now that we at least know what we're looking at, let's try a simple example to see how LabVIEW works with a little bit more detail. Alright, so I'm going to open up the Functions palette here, and I want to put in a sine waveform generator. Okay, so that's going to be under Signal Processing, Waveform Generators, and then Sine Waveform. Alright, so then I can just drop that in here. Now, with my mouse over this block, you can see there's a whole bunch of different terminals for this block. This top one here is frequency and amplitude, phase, error, sampling info, and there's a lot of these blocks have tons of terminals. Now, not all of them have to be used in order for the block to work. And if you ever get confused with how a block works, you can go online and just Google the block, and National Instruments has a very large help section. Now, I happen to know that to use this block, the only two things I need to give it are frequency and an amplitude. Alright, so what I can do is right-click this terminal, and then I can go down to Create Control. Alright, now when I did that, it created this numeric control. And notice that I have a block here in the block diagram, but it also created an object on the front panel as well. Alright, so there's one for my frequency, and I also want one for the amplitude. So I'll do the same thing. Right-click it, and go down to Create, Control. Bam. There's one for my amplitude. Okay. Now the other thing I want is I want a waveform graph so that we can see what we're doing. So right-clicked over on the front panel to get to my controls palette, and then I go down to Graphs and Waveform Graph. Click and place. Alright, and then you can see the same thing happens in this instance, but instead of placing something in my block diagram and getting it in the front panel, the opposite happened. I placed something in the front panel and got a block in my block diagram. Alright, so now I want an input for my waveform graph. So I go over to the sine wave generator, and this terminal right here is signal out. So I left click, and then you can see I'm starting to drag a wire across, and then I click on the terminal for the waveform graph. Alright, so that's a very basic setup that we got going here. So I can go over here and I can change the frequency or amplitude to anything I want, but for the moment let's just leave it how it is. So let's go ahead and run our virtual instrument, which I do by clicking on this little arrow right here. When I click, you can see I have my sine wave right here on the front panel. Now notice though that if I make an adjustment to say the amplitude, nothing happens. And that's because our program executed and then stopped. Alright, it's not a continuous process. So I can click run again, and you can see my amplitude jumped up to 3 and -3, you know. So if we want to make it continuous, what we need to do is we need to add a loop. Alright, to do that we go to the block diagram to access our functions palette, go to controls, and we'll insert a while loop. Alright, and the way loops work in LabVIEW is basically you make a giant square with everything that you want to be executed in the loop physically inside the square that you'll create. So we drag a square around everything that we've made, and then we unclick, and you can see we have everything inside this loop. So everything will be executed continuously inside this loop that we've created. Now, in order for LabVIEW to run this, though, we need to give the loop an end condition. Because without doing that, you're creating an infinite loop. And, you know, that's no good. So we go down here to the little stop sign, and the terminal you can see reads loop condition. So we'll right click on that and create control. And so the default for that is the stop button. And, you know, once again, you can see by creating this block in the block diagram, we get an object in our front panel. If I shift click on this, I can move the stop button around, get it a little farther away from our numeric controls. Alright, so now the idea is that if I select run, the program will run continuously until I hit the stop button. Alright, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'll hit run. So now the program is running continuously, and you might not be able to tell that, but let's go ahead and change our amplitude. And you can see by changing it to 4, my amplitude immediately jumped up to 4. I change it to 5, just keep changing it, and then I can change the frequency. And you'll notice that, you know, we get a few more waves inside of our 1 second sampling time here. And if I want the program to stop, I just have to click the button. Alright, so I hope this gave you a little bit more insight into LabVIEW.